They called me the dumb one, so they never checked the contract I wrote. That's the part my father still can't accept, even now, standing in that glass boardroom on the 42nd floor, staring at a document he thought he controlled. A deal worth $24 million, the kind of deal he'd been grooming my sister Olivia to inherit since she was 16. Harvard honors, perfect smile, perfect daughter. While I was the afterthought, the one he introduced as still figuring things out, the one who wasn't allowed in meetings, who got coffee orders instead of responsibilities, who sat at the far end of the table like furniture, silent, replaceable, forgettable. And for a while, I believed it. I really did. Because when someone repeats a label long enough, it starts to sound like truth. "You're not built for this," he told me once, tapping a stack of contracts like they were sacred texts. "Business requires precision, not guesswork." And I nodded like I understood, like I agreed. But what he never noticed, what none of them noticed, was that I stayed after those meetings, collecting the discarded drafts, reading every line they ignored, memorizing patterns, tracing the flow of money, the loopholes, the clauses buried in fine print. I didn't read like a lawyer. I read like someone who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. And somewhere between the third rejection, the 10th insult, and the 100th time being told to stay in my lane, I stopped trying to be seen and started building something they would never see coming. Because the truth is, when they locked me out of the room, they gave me the perfect place to rewrite the rules, and what they were about to sign that morning wasn't the deal they thought it was, not even close.
The first time I realized something was off was not during a meeting, not during one of my father's lectures about value and return. It was a Tuesday night, 11:42 p.m., the office was empty, lights dimmed to half power, and I was sitting alone with a stack of draft agreements Olivia had left behind, the ones she called routine. I remember staring at one clause for almost 20 minutes, a revenue distribution structure that looked clean on the surface, but the percentages did not reconcile, not if you followed the money past the second entity, and that is when it clicked. They were not reading these contracts, not really, they were trusting templates, trusting reputation, trusting each other, and that was their blind spot. Because I was not trained like them, I did not assume anything was correct. I checked everything, line by line, number by number, until patterns started forming in my head like a map, and once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. I started staying later after that, every night, sometimes until 1 or 2 in the morning, long after cleaning crews passed by and stopped asking questions. I would take discarded drafts from the recycling bin, smooth out the creases, and read, not just what was written, but what was missing, what could be moved, reworded, repositioned, small changes, invisible changes, the kind no one notices until it is too late, and I practiced, over and over again, rewriting sections in my notebook, testing structures, shifting clauses, learning how a single sentence could redirect millions of dollars without raising a single red flag. No one taught me, no one needed to, because every time my father said, "You would not understand this," he handed me another reason to learn it anyway. Olivia never noticed either. She moved fast, confident, always preparing for the next presentation, the next approval, the next step closer to taking over the company. She did not look back, she did not look down, and she definitely did not look at me. To her, I was background noise, predictable, harmless, safe to ignore, and that made me invisible in the best possible way, because while they were building their version of the deal, I was quietly building mine, not from scratch, never from scratch. I used their own structure, their own language, their own assumptions. I just adjusted the foundation, one clause, buried deep in section 12, subsection C, phrased in a way that looked standard, routine, forgettable, but it was not. It tied ownership rights to a performance trigger, and that trigger was something I controlled, something only I could activate. I remember the moment I typed my name into that clause. My hands did not shake, my heart did not race, it was quiet, almost calm, like I had finally stepped into a role no one else realized existed. And the next morning, when my father walked into the conference room talking about closing timelines and capital flow, when Olivia presented the final draft with that same confident smile, when the lawyer skimmed, nodded, and passed it along, I just sat there, at the far end of the table, exactly where they expected me to be, because the most powerful position in that room was the one no one was paying attention to, and what they were about to sign was already mine. The room felt different that morning, not louder, not quieter, just heavier, like something was already decided before anyone spoke, the kind of silence that settles right before a deal closes, before signatures lock and outcomes no one can undo. My father stood at the head of the table, hands resting on the polished surface, confident, controlled, exactly where he believed he belonged, while Olivia sat to his right, tablet open, scrolling through the final draft she had reviewed at least 3 times, maybe 4, her expression calm, precise, practiced. Across from them, the investors leaned back in their chairs, nodding along as numbers were repeated, projections reaffirmed, everything aligned, on paper, everything always looked perfect on paper. I stayed where I always was, near the end, just outside the main line of conversation, close enough to hear every word, far enough to be ignored. "Let us walk through the key terms one last time," Olivia said, her voice steady, professional, the voice they trusted, the voice they had invested in: revenue splits, timelines, performance benchmarks. She moved quickly, efficiently, like someone who had done this before, like someone who never expected to be questioned. My father watched her with quiet approval, occasionally adding a comment, reinforcing her authority, reinforcing the version of the future they had both agreed on, and for a moment, it almost worked, almost, because confidence has a way of smoothing over details, of convincing people that if something sounds right, it must be right, until someone actually looks. The lawyer sitting across from them had been quiet the entire time, flipping pages slowly, methodically, not rushing, not reacting, just reading. I recognized him, not personally, but by reputation, the kind of attorney who did not miss things, the kind who did not rely on summaries. And when he reached section 12, I saw it, the smallest pause, barely noticeable unless you were watching for it. His finger stopped moving, his eyes went back one line, then another. "Is there a concern?" my father asked, the confidence still there, but thinner now, stretched just enough to reveal the first crack. The lawyer did not answer immediately. He adjusted his glasses, leaned forward slightly, and read the clause again, out loud this time, slowly, clearly, every word landing heavier than the last: ownership transfer tied to performance trigger, activation authority assigned to a single named party. I felt Olivia shift beside him, just slightly, her posture tightening as she leaned in to follow along. "That is standard language," she said quickly, almost too quickly, trying to move past it, to keep control of the room, but the lawyer did not move on. "It is not the language that concerns me," he said, calm, measured. "It is the name attached to it." And then he turned the page toward them, toward my father, toward Olivia, and for the first time that morning, the room stopped pretending everything was under control. My father looked down at the document, eyes scanning, expecting to find an error, a typo, something small he could dismiss, but the longer he looked, the quieter he became, because there was no mistake, no ambiguity, just a name, clear, deliberate, impossible to ignore. "Mine." Olivia leaned closer, reading it herself, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief, like her mind was trying to rewrite what she was seeing into something that made sense. "That cannot be correct," she said, her voice lower now, controlled but strained. "It is correct," the lawyer replied, tapping the clause gently. "And it is enforceable," and that was the moment everything changed, not with a shout, not with a dramatic reaction, but with silence, the kind that forces everyone to confront what is right in front of them. My father finally looked up, not at the lawyer, not at Olivia, but at me, really looked at me, for the first time in years, and in that look, I could see it, the realization, the question he did not want to ask: how? And I did not answer, not yet, because the truth was, this was only the part they could see. What they did not understand, what they had not realized yet, was that the clause was just the beginning, and the moment that trigger activated, everything they thought they owned, everything they thought they controlled, would shift, completely. My father did not speak right away, and that alone told me everything had already shifted, because he was not a man who paused, not a man who hesitated, not a man who ever allowed silence to sit longer than he controlled it, but now, he was reading the same line again, slower this time, as if repetition might change what it said. Activation authority assigned to, he stopped, jaw tightening slightly, Ethan Carter, and hearing my name out loud in his voice, not as a dismissal, not as an afterthought, but as a legal fact, it landed differently, heavier, real. Olivia leaned back in her chair, blinking like she was recalibrating, her mind running through every version of that document she had approved, every revision she had signed off on, trying to locate the moment this could have happened, and not finding it, because there was no single moment, that was the point. This clause was not in the draft I reviewed, she said, steady but sharp, her control returning in pieces. It must have been altered after final approval, and for a second, the room leaned toward that explanation. Because it was easier to believe in an external error than an internal failure, but the lawyer shook his head, almost gently. The metadata shows no unauthorized changes, he said, tapping the page again. This language has been part of the document since version 3, and I watched it happen, the realization spreading, not fast, not dramatic, but precise, like a crack moving through glass, because version 3 was weeks ago, long before the final review, long before signatures, long before anyone thought to question anything. My father's eyes lifted again, locking onto mine, searching now, not dismissing. Searching. Explain this, he said, and it was not a request, it was a demand wrapped in disbelief, the kind of tone he used when something did not fit the world as he understood it. I did not rush to answer. I let the silence stretch just enough, let them sit with it, because for years, I had been the one waiting for permission to speak, and now, they were waiting on me. You said business requires precision, I said finally, my voice even, controlled, matching his. So I made sure every detail was correct. Olivia shook her head slightly, almost instinctively rejecting the idea. You were not part of this process, she said, you did not have access. And that was when I almost smiled, not out of arrogance, but out of recognition, because that was always their assumption, that access was something given, something controlled, something they could withhold. I did not need access, I said, I had visibility, and I could see the confusion behind her eyes. The difference between those two things had never mattered to her before, because she had always had both. My father stepped closer to the table, one hand pressing against the surface, grounding himself, recalculating. Even if this clause is valid, he said, choosing his words carefully now, rebuilding his authority piece by piece, it does not mean anything unless the trigger condition is met, and there it was, the last line of defense, the assumption that even if something had slipped through, it was still contained, still manageable, still under his control. I nodded slightly, because he was. Right, partially. Correct, I said, the clause does nothing, until the trigger activates, and for a brief moment, relief flickered across his face, small, controlled, but there, because in his mind, that meant there was still time, still leverage, still a way to fix it, undo it, neutralize it. And what exactly is that trigger? One of the investors asked, leaning forward now, interest replacing certainty, because this was no longer a routine signing, this was something else entirely. I looked at him, then back at my father, and then at the document. Section 8, I said, performance threshold tied to projected revenue within the first fiscal quarter. If the numbers exceed the baseline by 15%, I paused, just long enough. Control transfers, Olivia's eyes moved quickly across the pages, scanning, calculating, and then she froze, because she found it, the projection model, the numbers she had approved, the same numbers she had defended in this very room. That is not possible, she said, but her voice did not carry the same certainty anymore, because she was already doing the math, already seeing it. My father followed her gaze, reading, processing, and then it hit him, not all at once, but in pieces. The projections were conservative, intentionally conservative, to secure approval, to minimize risk, but the actual performance indicators, the real numbers, the ones I had been tracking quietly for months, were already trending higher, much higher. The threshold, he started, then stopped, because he knew, we all knew, it had already been crossed, not today, not in this room, but weeks ago, before anyone thought to question it, before anyone thought to look, and that was the moment the balance shifted completely, because this was no longer about what might happen, it was about what had already happened. You did this deliberately, he said, not angry, not yet, just certain now, finally understanding the shape of it, and I met his gaze without hesitation. You taught me to think in systems, I said, I just applied it, and around us, the room remained silent, but it was a different silence now, not confusion, not uncertainty, but recognition. Because they were no longer looking at the dumb one, they were looking at the person who had rewritten the outcome, and what none of them had asked yet, what none of them were ready to hear, was how far that outcome actually went, because the contract was only the first layer, and the next part was already in motion. No one spoke for a few seconds, not because they did not have questions, but because they were all recalculating at the same time, trying to understand how something this precise could have happened without triggering any alarms, without anyone noticing, and the answer was simple, because they were never looking for it. My father straightened slowly, his posture shifting back into something controlled, something deliberate, like he was rebuilding his position piece by piece, refusing to let the room see uncertainty for longer than necessary. Even if the threshold has been met, he said, voice steady again, control transfer is not immediate, there are verification steps, approvals, time delays. He glanced at the lawyer, looking for confirmation, for structure, for something that would slow this down, contain it, but the lawyer did not offer him that. Instead, he flipped a few pages back, scanning quickly, then stopping again. There is a secondary clause, he said, almost quietly, like he already knew this was not going to help. Activation can be executed upon confirmation of independent performance data, without delay, and I could feel the shift again, smaller this time, but sharper, because that clause was not an accident, none of it was. Olivia's hands were on the table now, fingers pressed flat against the surface, grounding herself, trying to hold on to something stable while everything else moved. Independent data, she repeated, almost to herself, then looked up at me, really looking this time, not past me, not around me, at me. You do not have access to that level of reporting, and there it was again, the assumption, access equals control. I shook my head slightly. No, I said, I do not have access to your reports. I have my own, and that was when one of the investors leaned forward, interest turning into concern. What does that mean? He asked, and I did not rush the answer, because this was the part they had not even considered, not even once. It means the performance trigger was not based on your internal projections, I said, it was based on external market indicators, vendor contracts, supplier flow, real numbers, not estimates. I could see it land, slowly, heavily, because those numbers were not part of Olivia's model, they were not part of the presentations, they were not part of the version of reality they had been working with. You changed the basis of evaluation, Olivia said, her voice sharper now, trying to regain ground. That is not standard practice, and I nodded. Correct, I said, it is not, but it is enforceable, and it is already verified. My father's expression did not break, but it tightened, the kind of tension that shows up in the smallest details, the way his jaw set, the way his hand pressed slightly harder against the table. Verified by who? He asked, and that question, that was the one that mattered, because it meant he understood this was no longer theoretical, no longer contained within this room. By the same third party your company uses for compliance audits, I said. They finalized the report 48 hours ago, and that was it. That was the moment the last piece fell into place, because now there was no delay, no uncertainty, no space left to argue process. The condition had been met, officially, independently, completely. The lawyer nodded slowly, almost reluctantly. If the report confirms the threshold has been exceeded, he said, choosing his words carefully, then control transfer is effective immediately, and just like that, it was done, not announced, not celebrated, just decided. My father exhaled slowly, not in defeat, not yet, but in recognition, because he could see it now, the full structure, the way each piece connected, the way each assumption he made had been used against him. You planned this, he said, quieter this time, more statement than accusation. and I met his gaze without hesitation. "You taught me to think long-term," I said. "I just stopped waiting for permission." Olivia looked between us, then back at the document, then at the lawyer, as if searching for something, anything, that had been missed, some technicality, some flaw, but there was nothing, because the system had worked exactly as it was designed to, just not in the way they expected. "So what happens now?" one of the investors asked, his voice cutting through the silence, practical, focused, already moving to the next step, because for him, this was not personal, it was structural, and structures adapt. I let a small pause settle, just enough to shift the weight of the moment, then I answered. "Now," I said, "we follow the contract," and for the first time, the word "we" did not mean them, it meant me, and what they had not realized yet, what they were only beginning to understand, was that following the contract meant following my decisions, my terms, my direction, because control was not just a clause, it was a shift in authority, in power, in who got to decide what came next, and what came next was not what they were expecting at all. The word "we" stayed in the air longer than anything else I had said, not loud, not aggressive, just different, like the room itself had to adjust to it, had to make space for something that had never been there before. My father noticed it immediately, of course he did, because language was power in his world, and power had always been his to define, until now. "There is no we here," he said, calm but firm, stepping back into the version of himself that had controlled every room for the past 30 years. "You may have inserted yourself into this contract, but that does not make you qualified to lead anything." And there it was, the last label, the one he had used my entire life, not capable, not ready, not enough. I did not react to it, not outwardly, because I had heard it too many times for it to carry weight anymore. "Qualification is not the clause," I said quietly, "control is," and I watched it land, not just on him, but on everyone else in the room, because they understood what that meant. In business, qualification could be debated, argued, delayed, but control was binary, you either had it, or you did not. Olivia leaned forward again, her voice sharper now, more focused, trying to reframe the situation, to pull it back into something she could manage. "Even if control transfers," she said, "you still need operational authority, board approval, executive support. You cannot just walk in and take over." And that was the difference between how they thought, and how I had learned to think. They believed power was granted, layered, dependent on agreement. I understood that power, real power, came from structure, from leverage, from positioning. "You are right," I said, nodding slightly, "I cannot just walk in. I have to follow the structure," and for a brief second, she relaxed, just a fraction, because that sounded like limitation, like constraint, like something she could still work around, until I finished the sentence. Which is why I already did. The room shifted again, subtle, but undeniable, because now it was not just about what had happened, it was about what had already been set in motion. My father's eyes narrowed slightly, focusing, recalculating. "Explain," he said, and this time, there was no hesitation, no delay, because this part had never been about surprise, it had always been about timing. 3 weeks ago, I said, I submitted a restructuring proposal through a subsidiary channel, under a different reporting line, fully compliant, fully documented. Olivia's head turned sharply toward me, recognition flashing across her face, because she remembered it, a minor submission, routine, something that had passed through review without priority, without scrutiny. "That proposal," she started, then stopped, because she already knew, she just did not want to say it out loud. "Was approved," I finished for her, "unanimously," and that word, unanimously, it carried weight, because it meant they had all agreed, every single one of them, without realizing what they were agreeing to. "The restructuring aligns operational authority with controlling interest," I continued, keeping my voice steady, precise, the same way they had taught me to speak in these rooms. "Which means, as of this morning, the reporting structure has already shifted." One of the investors leaned back slowly, exhaling under his breath, not surprised, not anymore, just impressed, because he understood what had been done, not just the contract, not just the clause, but the system around it, the preparation, the alignment, the inevitability of it. My father did not move for a moment, then he let out a slow breath, almost a quiet laugh, not amused, not exactly, but acknowledging something. You planned every layer, he said, and it was not a question, it was recognition, finally. I met his gaze, steady. You always said, if you build a system, build it so it does not rely on anyone else, I said, so I did. Olivia looked down at the table, then back at me, something different in her expression now, not dismissal, not disbelief, something closer to understanding, maybe even respect, but mixed with something else, something sharper, because she knew what this meant, not just for the company, but for her. So what happens to us, she asked, and the word sounded different now, smaller, uncertain, and I paused, not because I did not have an answer, but because this was the first time anyone had asked the right question, not how, not why, but what next, and that was the part they had never prepared for, because they had never imagined a future where I was the one deciding it. I looked around the room, at the investors, at the lawyer, at Olivia, and finally, at my father, and I answered. That depends, I said, calm, controlled. On whether you are willing to work within the system you built, or against it, and the silence that followed, it was not empty, it was full of realization, of consequences, of choices that were no longer theirs to define, because for the first time, they were not deciding the outcome, they were responding to it, and what none of them had asked yet, what none of them were ready to hear, was the condition I had already set, before any of them walked into that room. No one moved right away, because what I had just said was not a threat, it was a shift, and shifts take a second to register. My father was the first to recover, of course, he always was. You are assuming we will accept this, he said, voice controlled, but there was something different. Underneath now, not doubt, not fear, something closer to resistance, like he was testing the boundaries of what still belonged to him. This company was built long before you decided to involve yourself, he continued, stepping forward slightly, reclaiming space, and it will not be redirected by a clause buried in paperwork, and there it was, the belief that power came from history, from legacy, from what had already been built. I listened, let him finish, because I understood that perspective. I had grown up inside it. You are right, I said calmly, it was built long before me, but it was also structured long before me. I paused, just enough. And structures can be reinterpreted. Olivia exhaled slowly, shaking her head once, like she was clearing something, resetting. Even if everything you are saying holds, she said, more measured now, more strategic, you still need alignment, investors, partners, internal leadership. Without that, control is unstable, and that was the first real argument, not emotional, not dismissive, but structural, and I respected that, because it meant she finally understood where this was actually happening. Alignment matters, I said, nodding slightly, which is why I secured it first, and I watched their reactions carefully, not just my father and Olivia, but the others, the investors, the lawyer, the ones who had been silent until now, because this was where the room truly shifted. One of the investors leaned forward, fingers interlaced, studying me in a way he had not before, not as background, not as irrelevant, but as a variable. What exactly do you mean by that? He asked, and I met his gaze directly. I mean that before this meeting was scheduled, I said, I had already met with 2 of your partners, privately, off-cycle, to review alternative projections. A pause, small, deliberate. They agreed the current model was underperforming. The room tightened again, not loudly, but you could feel it, because this was no longer contained within the family, this extended beyond them, into the structure they thought they controlled. Olivia's eyes moved quickly between the investors, searching for confirmation, for denial, for anything, but what she found instead was silence, and silence, in rooms like this, was agreement. My father's expression hardened slightly, not breaking, but adjusting. And what did you offer them? He asked, and that question carried weight, because it acknowledged something he had not said out loud yet, that this was not an accident, not luck, this was negotiation. Clarity, I said simply, a structure that reflects actual performance, not projections designed to pass approval. One of the investors nodded almost imperceptibly, confirming it without saying a word, and that was enough, more than enough, because now the alignment was visible, not announced, but understood. So this was coordinated, Olivia said, quieter now, the sharp edge replaced by something more analytical, more aware. Not just the contract, the timing, the approvals, the data. She trailed off, because she could see the pattern now. The same pattern I had been following for months. My father let out a slow breath, then another, grounding himself, recalibrating. You went outside the process, he said, not accusing, just stating, and I nodded. No, I said, I followed a different one, and that distinction mattered, because I had not broken the system. I had used parts of it they were not paying attention to, the overlooked channels, the secondary reviews, the assumptions they never questioned. And now, the same investor asked, his tone neutral, but focused, because this was the moment that mattered, not what had happened, but what came next. I let a small pause settle, not for effect, but for clarity, because this was the part that defined everything else. Now, I said, we implement the transition, exactly as outlined. I turned slightly, just enough to include the entire room. Leadership restructuring, reporting realignment, performance-based oversight, each word placed carefully, deliberately, the same way they had always spoken, but now, it carried a different authority. Effective immediately, and there it was, the line, the shift from possibility to execution. Olivia looked at me, really looked, not as competition, not as threat, but as reality, and for the first time, she did not argue, she did not push back, she just understood. My father remained still for a moment longer, then he straightened, adjusting his jacket slightly, like he was stepping into something new, something he had not chosen, but could not ignore. You think this changes everything, he said, quieter now, not dismissive, not certain, just honest, and I met his gaze, steady. It already has, I said, and the silence that followed, it was not resistance anymore, it was acceptance, not of me, not yet, but of the fact that the system had shifted, and what none of them had asked, what none of them had fully grasped yet, was that this was not the end of the transition, it was only the beginning, because the next step was not about control, it was about consequences, and those were already in motion.